We said, yes, it is. Quite a moment. She said, you know what you all ought to do? You ought to write a letter to somebody you're thinking about in this moment. I want you to imagine this now. We're getting ready to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. 2 black senators standing there, Cory Booker, Raphael Warnock, sitting in the chair, a former black senator. And when the 3 of us were there together, at that time we represented more than a quarter of the U.S. black senators in the history of the Republic. 3 of us. And there have been over 2,000 senators. 3 of us there were more than a quarter of the black senators in the whole history of the country. She said, you all ought to write a letter to somebody you're thinking about in this moment. She made that suggestion, you know, the way black women make suggestions. In fact, one of them just sent me up a suggestion and reminded me that the new chair of the NNPA is Bobby Henry Sr. Give him a great big round of applause. She said, you ought to write a letter. And then she handed each of us a sheet of paper.
All right.
But it wasn't just any sheet of paper, it was the letterhead of the Vice President of the United States. And I took my sheet of paper and I, being the obedient person I am, I went and sat down, wrote a letter. Because the only job I like better than being Georgia's United States Senator and Ebenezer's pastor is dad to Chloe and Caleb. I sat down and I wrote a letter to my then 5-year-old daughter. And I said, dear Chloe, today we confirm to the United States Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. In the long history of our nation, she is the first Supreme Court justice who looks like you.
All right.
With hair like yours. As we were confirming her, a friend of mine, the vice president, suggested that I write a letter. By the way, in the long history of our nation, she's the first vice president who looks like you. And so I write you just to say that in America, you can achieve anything you set your head and your heart to do. Love, Dad. That was my letter to my 5-year-old daughter. But I was thinking about all of our daughters, and I was so moved by the moment that I couldn't just mail the letter. I couldn't wait to get home, to fly home to Georgia. I called her on FaceTime.
All right.
And I read the letter, poured out my heart to my 5-year-old daughter, read that letter to her. She listened. She was not impressed. She said, can I go out and play now? She didn't understand it then, but she'll understand it better later. But in the years since I wrote that letter to my daughter, it occurred to me that the work that I do as a legislator every day is a letter to all of our children. And so in this critical moment in America, when there are those who are rising up and trying to turn diversity into a cuss word, and coming after equity and inclusion as if this is something that we ought to be against. In this moment, when there are forces at work trying to take us back, we ought to ask ourselves, what do we want our letter to our children to say? I want my letter to say that I stood up in this defining moment in America. I want my letter to say that not only did I vote, I made sure everybody in my circle voted. I want my letter to say that I used the gifts that I had to write and to tell the story about e pluribus unum, out of many, one, a country that's big enough and broad enough to embrace each of us. I want my letter to say that I stood up for justice, that I stood up for righteousness, that I stood up for truth, that I stood up for the least and the left out. I want my letter to say that I stood up for women and their right to choose, that I stood up for workers and their right to enjoy the prosperity that they're creating for others. I want my letter to say that I stood up and I did the best that I could. Keep the faith.